Well, good day. We speaking Australian now. Good day. All right. So I got lots of questions here. The children have made a lot. They're very curious children here, and I appreciate that. That's good. So I'm not going to put them in any particular order. I'm just going to read them like they are. And this first one says, "How did the thunder work?" And so lightning is very hot. It's like 50,000 degrees. That's 3 times hotter than the surface of the sun. And when that lightning goes through those lightning channels, it heats the air so fast, it expands so fast, it's a shock wave. All right? And shock wave would be like, you have a bullwhip. You ever use a bullwhip and it has a little cracker on the end, and you do the bullwhip and it cracks on the end. It's going faster than the speed of sound. So that's a little shock wave on the end of a bullwhip. So it's the same kind of thing with thunder. The air expands faster than the speed of sound, and it makes that noise, that thunder, that shock wave. Next one is, how can you become a scientist? So it requires a combination of education and training and experience. So I would say you need a strong academic background. You need usually some kind of research experience where you go into the lab and do experiments and see how things work out. And you probably need strong communication skills, both written and verbal, in order to be a good scientist. So that's kind of the short answer, but it depends what kind of scientist you want to become, too. This one says, did Cain and Abel go to heaven? Well, it's hard to know if anybody goes to heaven because you can't see into their heart, isn't it? We know in Genesis 4:3-4, that God accepted Abel's offering, but not Cain's. So we have a pretty good idea that Abel probably went to heaven, and Cain could have gone to heaven too. He had repented and trusted that God was going to send a sacrifice to redeem him from his sins. They were looking ahead to Christ's crucifixion, and so Cain, if he went to heaven, he had to get saved the same way that we get to heaven, okay? And that is by trusting in the Redeemer. But we don't know. Next one is, what are your thoughts about Tiktaalik? Now, Tiktaalik is an extinct lobe-finned fish, and they found it in Canada some while ago, and it was squished flat. But the evolutionists think that it was a missing link between fish and amphibians because it had bones in its fins, and they thought maybe it could get up on the land and somehow start breathing or whatever. And but we have modern lobe fish that have bones in their fins. The big problem is not the bone. The big problem is that the bone needs to be attached to something. That is, needs to be attached to the backbone, all right, to the rest of the skeleton, and that's what these lobefish don't have. And the same with Tiktaalik. Its bones and its fins are not attached to the backbone. So that's not going to be enough for it to really climb up on land and move around there. It doesn't have the strength to be able to do that. And then we have, how do some animals change colors? So some animals like chameleons and lizards change their colors. They have pigments in their special cells in their skin, and they make it bigger and smaller. They change the size of the pigment, and that changes the color. And then octopuses and cuttlefish, they have a different mechanism. They have layers of reflective palettes, color palettes, that they mix and get all sorts of iridescent colors. A little bit more like what the peacock does as far as the colors of the peacock feathers, because it depends on the angle of the light, what color you actually see. So there's 2 different main mechanisms for producing colors, changing colors. So that'd be kind of cool if we could do that, wouldn't it? Okay, we could match our skin to the color of our tie or whatever. I could have a red face today or something like that. But we don't have that ability. God gave those animals that ability. Why did you start learning about science? This is from Sarah Grace. And so my parents gave me a chemistry set for Christmas. Now this is, back in those days, this is not the kind of chemistry set you have these days that are fully vetted by lawyers. This is a chemistry set where you could do serious harm to yourself and to others, okay? And so at one point, I was so involved in my chemistry set that I set the house on fire. And I still remember my brother coming down the stairs where I was in the basement and putting the flames out with a wet towel, okay? My parents weren't home at the time. But they obviously knew about this when they got home and smelled the smoke. And so they took my chemistry set away from me for a whole year. Weren't they mean? And so you know how it is when there's something you love and you can't have it, you want it even more, right? That's human nature. So that was the beginning of my love of science. And so that carried all the way through. When I was in junior high school, I was a terrible student. I shouldn't tell the kids this, but my father was an immigrant, all right? He had a 7th grade education. He didn't have a lot of pushing to do well in school, okay? That just wasn't part of our family. And I was a pretty straight C and D student in junior high school. So when we got to, this is public school, so when I got to 9th grade, they wouldn't let me take science because they put me in the shop track, vocational track, and they had me making napkin holders. And I was terrible at making napkin holders. I really was bad at it. And I wanted to be in science because I loved my chemistry set. And so there was my guidance counselor's name was Mr. Riebling, and he was the one who was not letting me take college prep courses or take chemistry or anything. And Mr. Riebling died of a heart attack in the hallway of my school. I still remember stepping around his body to get to class before the police got there. And so they couldn't hire anybody fast enough, so they just handed the forms out, so just fill in what you want to take next year. And I put chemistry down. That was the beginning of my chemistry career, okay? By the time I was a senior in high school, I was getting all A's. So for those of you who have junior high school students and you despair that they'll ever become human, it just takes a little while. You just got to wait, and sometimes, like me, they catch fire, okay? So I hope that's an encouragement to you. All right, so that's more than you wanted to hear. This is, when did God create angels? Well, Exodus 20:11 tells us that God made everything in 6 days, but we're not told on which day he made the angels. So many people think, well, maybe it's the first day. And some people wonder about that. They say, well, when did Satan fall and all that take place? But I suspect that angels experience time differently than we do. Because we are in physical bodies, we experience time in a certain way. Time doesn't have any meaning if there's just one thing, all right, if God, all right? But once he creates two things, then you can say it takes this long to get from here to there. And so I suspect angels don't experience time the same way that we do, and so who knows how much of angel time was crammed in to that first day of creation. I don't know, but we're not told about that. This one, since polar bear hairs are transparent and they reflect the snow, if a polar bear is in a green field, will it turn green? So polar bears don't have transparent hair, I'm sorry to say. Their hairs are hollow and they appear white. So the hollow structure of the hair allows it to trap heat and keeps the polar bear warm. And the white color helps it blend in with the snowy surroundings. So if you put a polar bear in a green field, it's still going to be white. Okay, it's not going to be green. Unless sometimes you've seen green polar bears because they have algae. The algae's growing in their hairs and they turn a little green because they have something growing on them, okay? And you would probably turn green too if you didn't take a bath very often, okay? So that's something to think about. And then it says the sun looks yellow and the ocean is blue. How can the sun produce colors that make the ocean blue? This is from Kara. So the sun is not actually yellow, okay? I know when we when we draw it in coloring books and that type of thing, we use a yellow crayon. But the sun is actually white. You say, well, it looks yellow to me, but actually you've never really looked at the sun. If you looked at the sun, you wouldn't be seeing anything else. Okay, we don't look directly at the sun. The sun's actually white, and it produces all the colors of the spectrum. And deep bodies of water absorb the yellow and the orange and the green and the red and so forth. But it doesn't absorb the blue. Because of the size of the water molecules, it reflects the blue back out again. And so it appears blue. So the reason it looks blue is because it's absorbing all the other colors besides blue. Now, if you go real deep in the water, below 42 meters, it'll absorb the blue too, and then the water's black. So you've seen deep sea divers and so forth. It's all black down there, okay? So those are all very good questions. I was really pleased with what good questions the young people had, so keep it up. There's some more paper back there, and we'll get some more tomorrow if you want to do that. All right, tonight we're going to talk about the moon. All right, let me get my clicker and we'll be ready to go. Okay, so we find about the moon in Genesis 1:14. Okay, and God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night. Let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. Let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth and to rule over the day and over the night and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and the evening and the morning were the fourth day. So our topic today is that lesser light mentioned in verse 16, our moon. Same moon that Adam and Eve looked at, 250,000 miles away, or a mere light seconds if you prefer. It's a quarter the size of the earth, so it would be a lunar baseball compared to the earth's basketball. So where did the moon come from? Well, Genesis tells us directly where it came from. Not only tells us directly, the moon itself provides one of the strongest evidences for understanding that it was created. If you don't believe in the Bible, what are you going to do? Well, many careers, many dollars have been spent by those who don't believe that what the Bible has to say about the origin of the moon. And they've been trying to figure out where the moon came from for a very long time. So when I was in high school, or junior high school, actually in 8th grade, this is what they taught me in my 8th grade class, my earth science class. They taught me the fission theory, okay? And that is that the earth is just a big ball of molten lava and so forth, and it's spinning so fast that this blob comes off the moon. And in my book, in my 8th grade science book, it showed that where the moon came out, that was where the Pacific Ocean was, okay? I didn't know that. They had a picture, so it must have been true. And, well, there's problems with this. The first problem is that the Earth's not spinning fast enough for that to be true. The Earth would have to be spinning 10 times faster for that to be true, okay? Now, you think you have trouble getting your work done now, 24 hours in a day? What if the day was 2.5 hours? How would you do with that? That would be interesting, wouldn't it? To have the moon spinning that fast. And then there's a problem with what we call the Roche limit. So the Roche, or the breakup limit. So when you have a moon, it has tidal forces from the Earth, gravitational forces on it, from the front of the moon and the back of the moon. They're different. And so if the moon is too close to the Earth, it just rips it apart. And you get a ring. You don't get a moon. Okay? So if this blob goes out, it would have been ripped apart, and you would have ended up with a ring and no moon at all, ring like Saturn has, for example. So that's a problem. And then, if you remember, in the late 1960s, we went to the moon and we got some rocks, and we found out that moon rocks are different than Earth rocks. So moon rocks don't have much iron in them, and Earth rocks have lots of iron in them. And so they gave up on that, okay? So they didn't teach the fission theory anymore. So in the 1970s, they came up with another theory, and that is the capture theory. And so you have the moon out there sort of wandering around, minding its own business, and it's captured by the Earth's gravitational field. And it somehow inserts itself into almost a perfectly circular orbit around the Earth. Now, sometimes kids will ask me, well, how does the moon stay up there? How come it doesn't fall to Earth? I forgot this demonstration today, so I need to do it now. And so this would be a good demonstration of centripetal force. So I'm going to put some water in this cup. Those of you who were here this afternoon know this is my Clemson cup because it's tiger orange. And so the moon stays up there by centripetal force. Now, centripetal force for the moon is gravity. For this, it is these strings. So the strings pull on the platform, and the platform pushes on the cup. Cup pushes on the water, and if I'm careful, I can keep it going around without spilling the water like that. See? Okay? Or I can do it like this. Okay? So I did this in a nursing home one time. Nursing homes are hot and humid, and the water was cold. And so it sweated on the bottom. So I did that, and the cup went shoo, out like that, right over the top of a 90-year-old guy in a wheelchair. Okay? So I'm glad I didn't hit him because I'd be in jail now. I wouldn't be able to talk to you. Okay? So anyway, that's my demonstration for tonight. So I had to do some demonstration. Okay, so now when I was growing up, I grew up in the New Jersey suburbs of Philadelphia. And we had a lot more freedom back in those days. And so when I was a young teenager, I would get on the high-speed line and go to the Franklin Institute, which was a science museum. And they had a proto-video game, I guess I would call it. We didn't have video games back then, but you can imagine the attraction of that for somebody my age. And so the game was you had to insert a rocket ship around a planet. And you had to get the angle right and the speed right and insert it. I never could do it. I tried and tried and tried. Every time my rocket ship came close, it went shoo, into outer space. And so it impressed upon me, even at that tender age, that it's very difficult to do that. So the idea that the moon is sort of wandering around out there and inserts itself in a circular orbit, nobody could believe that. I couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe it. And they finally gave up on that idea. All right, so the next theory they came up with is the condensation theory. So you have this big cloud of gas and dust, and it starts circling around, and gravity pulls it together and forms the Earth and the moon. But nobody could figure out why does it just form a bigger Earth? Why two things? Why Earth and a moon? And you can't even get it to work in a computer. So they couldn't figure that out. They're trying to resurrect the condensation theory. They call it the synasia theory. If you look on TED Talks and so forth, the synasia theory, they're trying to get it to work. And in their theory, you had the moon forms first and then the Earth, but it still doesn't work out. The elemental distribution doesn't work out, like manganese is wrong and so forth. So they still haven't worked that out, but they're trying to resurrect it because they know the theory they have now doesn't work. And then the collision theory. So if you go online now and say, where did the moon come from? They'll direct you to the NASA site. And it's the collision theory. This is what's taught in all the public schools in this area. Okay? And so the idea is that there was a planet about the same size as Mars called Theia. It must be real if it has a name, right? So it's Theia. And Theia runs into the Earth and smashes into it. All this debris goes up and forms the moon. Okay? And now, one of the problems with that is that I call it the big whack. Okay? So you have to have at least two big whacks. If you have just one big whack, the angular momentum doesn't work out. Now, what that means, kids, is the turning energy, all right? And it doesn't work in a computer, it doesn't work anywhere. So you have to have a whack from this side, a whack from that side in order to get it to work out, okay? And it has to be pretty much at the same time. Then there's the problem of the fact that the moon is moving away from the Earth. Did you know that? The moon is about 1.5 inches. So about 1.5 inches every year, the moon is moving further away from the Earth. Well, that's not a big deal. For us that believe in the Earth and the moon are only like 6,000 years old, it's like 12 miles. A big deal, okay? We're talking about the difference, 12 miles compared to 250,000 miles. Not, hardly even notice it. But if you believe that the Earth is billions of years old, now you got a problem. Even 1 billion years, the moon and the Earth are going to be right next to each other. And guess what? It's inside the Roche limit. And it breaks up. You get a ring. You don't get a moon. Okay. Plus, not to mention the fact, if the moon's that close, the tides are so large they overflow the Earth, twice a day. That's not conducive to living on the planet. Okay. So that's what they teach. And the problem I have with that is that they know it doesn't work. And they know it doesn't even work in computers. And yet they teach it to every school child in this country, knowing it doesn't work. That's why they're working on the synaesthesia theory, because they know it doesn't work. So there's something fundamentally dishonest about teaching children something you know is not true. I can understand if you thought, well, it could be true, but they know it's not true. And so I have a problem with that philosophically, that they're doing that kind of thing. Well, even though one more thing, and that is, what if you know that none of these theories work and you don't believe the Bible? Okay, what are you going to do then? Well, then you have what's called the artificial moon theory. Okay? So the idea is, these guys who wrote this book, Who Built the Moon, Christopher Knight and Alan Butler, you can see it on YouTube. They have the whole thing laid out there. And they realize that there's something up with the moon. It's so different and so unusual that they believe that the moon was like the Death Star. It was made by aliens. Okay, and once we get smart enough to realize the aliens made the moon, then the aliens are going to come back and they're going to invite us to join their parliament or Congress or whatever aliens have. All right, so we can look forward to that. Now, you can read the whole book, but there are a lot of unusual things about the moon. But their biggest proof is this one. That is, I call it God's signature in the sky. So we had a lunar eclipse back in 2017 in Greenville. And everybody noticed that the moon and the sun were the same size in the sky. Now, this is remarkable. There's no other planet where you could stand on the surface of that planet and look at the moon of that planet and the sun and see them the same size in the sky. Only here. And then you have to believe, they believe that they know the moon's been moving away from the Earth, so you have to believe that it's only in this particular time in evolutionary history where the moon and the sun are the same size in the sky. Now, how's that possible? Well, the sun is 400 times further away from the Earth than the moon. But the moon is 400 times smaller, so that it blots it out like that. So I think that's God signing his work. He's saying, I did this. Okay? Isaac Asimov was head of the Humanist Association. He had a PhD in biochemistry. He was an atheist. And he said that the fact that the sun and the moon are the same size in the sky, if it wasn't a coincidence, would be the strongest proof for God, that he thought. But of course, he knew it was a coincidence. I'm not sure how he knew that, but that's what he knew. All right. So I call that God's signature in the sky. Well, why did God make the moon? Well, he tells us in Jeremiah 31:35, thus saith the Lord, which giveth the moon for a light by night. So it's a night light, among other things. Okay. Deuteronomy 33:14 says, and for the precious fruits brought forth by the sun, and for the precious things brought forth by the moon. Now, I know my name is George, and I know George means farmer, but I am far from a farmer. Okay, I grew up in the city. I grew up in the Philadelphia area, just a block or two from the high-speed line. One time, one of my schoolmates asked me if I would sleep over with him in the country. I couldn't sleep. It was too quiet. I was used to those trains rumbling, past me all night long. So it was too quiet to sleep. And when I was 12 years old, they took our class on a field trip to see a cow. I'd never seen a cow close up. I mean, I'd seen them from the car and highways and, that type of thing. And I just thought that milk came in those big glass bottles they delivered to my house. I didn't know it. Okay. So I am not a farmer, but I've talked to a lot of farmers, even in Australia. And I'd say to the sugarcane farmers, does the moon have any effect on your crop? And they all say yes. Okay. I've read some articles about protein content in rye grains and so forth that seem to be affected by the moon. I don't know how all that works, okay? And, but these farmers assured me that there's a connection there. So remember what we talked about Sunday night? We said, Martin Luther said that give God the honor of being smarter than you are, okay? So if the science in the science hasn't caught up to where the Bible is, it just means the Bible's ahead of our scientific knowledge right now. Someday, maybe we'll understand how the moon affects the crops. Right now, we don't really understand how that works. If you know, tell me afterwards and we'll get the Nobel Prize, all right? So people want to know, can the moon affect human behavior? So Psalm 121:6, the sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. Now, I can understand how the sun can smite you because my hairdo, okay? I got that. I got to wear a hat. But how does the moon smite somebody? How is that possible? Well, in Matthew 4:24, it says, Jesus' fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought unto him among all those he healed. It says those which were lunatic, and he healed them. So lunatic, the Greek word, just means moonstruck, okay? And, or moonsick or moonstruck. Now, if you look at a modern translation, a lot of times they'll translate that word as epileptic. But there's nothing in the word that means epileptic, all right? They're just the translators are trying to figure out what it means, all right? They don't have any idea. So again, as I travel around, talk to people. In fact, last time I talked about the moon, I was in a church and a nurse came up and said, that she wanted everybody to know that they had to put extra nurses on the ward during times of full moons. I've talked to law enforcement. They have to have extra cops on the beat. I've talked to teachers, and it affects their students' behavior and so forth. And so everywhere I go, mental health workers and so forth say that. And so I believe it. So every fundamental church I've been in pretty much has at least one crazy person in it, okay? And I was in San Francisco in Dr. Innes's church, and I said that, and there was a guy in the back corner who he said, "That's me!" And everybody turned around and said, "That's him!" And he was, indeed, a little off, all right? Isn't it wonderful that mentally ill people feel comfortable in fundamental churches? They feel loved. That's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. Anyway, we used to go to Wally Jaworski's church in Ingham, Australia, and there was a man named John, and John was crazy. And he was a Christian, loved the Lord, but his mind didn't work properly, okay? And so one time I went to visit him in the mental hospital, and I said, "John, how did you sleep last night?" "Oh," he said, "I couldn't sleep at all." He said, "There was a full moon." He said, "All the other people here, they were howling like wolves and climbing the walls and rattling the bars and that kind of thing." He said, "You can't get," he said, "This place is full of crazy people," he said. And so even this crazy guy, he understood that, somehow the moon affects human behavior. It seems to be, from what I can tell, it's when it's cloudless. It doesn't seem to work when there's a full moon and it's hidden by the clouds, as far as I can tell. But again, I don't know. Again, give God the honor of being smarter than you are. Ancient people used to use the moon to tell time. This is the Antikythera mechanism found on the bottom of the Aegean Sea. And it dates back to, the time of, the Greek classics and so forth. And interesting, it was made of bronze, so it survived its bath in seawater. And it's an analog computer. You guys will work with computers. This is an analog computer, and it's all these dials of brass, and you can actually tell them where all the planets and the moon and all were at any particular time just by turning the dial. And we weren't able to do it until we actually x-rayed it and picked it apart and were able to make a copy of it and so forth. So unless you think ancient people are dumb, okay, they made something like this that we'd have a hard time making today. Ancient people used the moon as a calendar. The month is roughly based on the lunar cycle. They used it as a compass. So back in those days, they could actually look at the moon and they could tell which way was north, south, east, west. So that was important. And they used it to tell that it actually knew it. It actually causes a season. So Psalm 104, verse 19, it says, "He appointed," that is, God appointed the moon for seasons. Now, what does the moon and the seasons have in common? Well, the seasons are caused by the tilt of the Earth. So the Earth tilts at 23.5 degrees, okay? And so we often think that when the Earth, our side of the Earth is closer to the sun, this is the sun, that it's summer, but that's not true. In the northern hemisphere, it's like this. Northern hemisphere, we're actually a little further away, okay? So that the seasons are caused by the tilt, okay? If as I mentioned on Sunday school, if the Earth was just straight up and down, then all the water would freeze at the poles and have a big desert in between. So that tilt wouldn't be stable unless the moon was there to stabilize it. How's the moon stabilize it? The moon circles the Earth in ecliptic. Most moons, most planets are in the equatorial region, around the fattest part of the planet. Our moon is in the ecliptic. So a plane is defined by 3 points. So the sun, the moon, and the Earth, that's the plane. That's the ecliptic. That's why we get eclipses sometimes. And so that moon in that unusual ecliptic orbit stabilizes the tilt of the moon and keeps the seasons stable. Now Mars, as I mentioned on Sunday, doesn't have a big moon like we have, so its tilt goes from 0 to 60 degrees. Okay, we can't live on a planet like that where the tilt changes like that. Elon Musk hasn't figured that out, but it's true. Okay, it's not going to work. Okay, so how did the psalmist know that the moon caused the seasons? Well, only because of divine inspiration. Nobody else thought that way. Okay, this is directly from God. So here's a picture of the moon like you've never seen it. So this is a picture taken from a spacecraft that's 1 million miles closer to the sun than the moon is. And looking back on the Earth with the moon crossing. I put an arrow there so you can see where the North Pole is to see the tilt. Now what should strike you about that is how dark the moon looks. See how dark it looks? Now when we see the moon, we see it against the blackness of outer space, so it looks bright because it's against a black background. If you look at it against the Earth, it looks dark. In fact, the moon has a reflectivity similar to the asphalt out in your parking lot out here, used asphalt. Okay, so why would God make the moon so dark? Well, there's a lot of organisms, a lot of animals and so forth that take their biological clues from the light of the moon. And so if the moon was too bright, it would look like the sun and would throw everything off. So God made the moon dark for a good reason. He has a purpose in this. He also used the moon, created the moon to glorify himself. Psalm 148:3 says, "Praise ye him, sun and moon. Praise him, all ye stars of light." Now, I heard you singing today, and you're praising God with your voices, but you may have noticed that the man in the moon doesn't have a mouth, okay? The moon can't sing, all right? So how does the moon praise God? Well, the moon praises the God the same way we do, is that's by doing what it was created to do. Now, all of you have something that you can do that other people can't do, that you could use to benefit the church, benefit the community. Just think how much better your church would be, your community would be, if everybody here did whatever it is that you do better than somebody else, that God is giving you that ability. My wife has this organizational talent. People who saw my presentation today, they realized I needed her help today. but she uses her organizational ability to serve God, to glorify Him. I have the science thing, and I try to use my science thing to serve God. So what is it that you have that you can use that would allow you to serve God in a way that no one else in the congregation can do that? So everybody has something. Well, think about the moon. So what does the moon do? Well, the moon gives us the tides, and the tides stir up the currents on the bottom of the ocean, and those currents take the dead organic matter that's floated at the bottom of the ocean and bring it up to the surface near the edges of the continents, and then green plants like algae eat the dead organic matter and produce oxygen. So most of the oxygen that you're breathing right now comes from the ocean. I know they tell you that it comes from Brazil, but that's not true. Most of it comes from the ocean, okay? And so if the moon didn't do its job, you wouldn't have the tides, and you wouldn't have the currents, you wouldn't have the upwelling, you wouldn't have the production of oxygen, and you all die. Okay, you're all going to die of asphyxiation. So the moon, it praises God by keeping us alive. That's pretty good, isn't it? Some idiot back in the 1960s talked about taking a nuclear missile and blowing the moon up. That would have been a bad idea, for sure. All right. And it's beautiful. We talked about that in Sunday morning, the beauty of God's creation. Song of Solomon 6:10 says, "Who is she that looketh forth as the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, and terrible as an army with banners?" Now, this terrible with an army as banners doesn't work well in Valentine's cards, okay? So what's he talking about? Well, he's thinking about the stars moving across the sky at night, and he's thinking of it as like soldiers moving in a battle array across the field, and he thinks that's a beautiful thing, okay? So he's talking about the sun, moon, and stars there. And then, 1 Corinthians 15:41, there's one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars, so one star differeth from another star in glory. So that's a hallmark of God's creative style. He makes it functional, he uses it to keep us alive, and he makes it beautiful. I think of this song, "Fair is the sunshine, fair still the moonlight, and all the twinkling starry host. Jesus shines brighter, Jesus shines purer than all the angels heaven can boast." So do you think that Jesus Christ is more beautiful than the silvery shell of the moon reflected off the water, okay? And I say yes. And why? Because it has to do with the gospel, right? And so if that doesn't resonate with you, if you say, what on earth is he talking about? Then you need to talk to somebody, okay? Why do we think Jesus Christ is more beautiful than the moon? Well, we see the moon as a reminder of God's enduring promises. Psalm 72:5 says, "They shall fear thee," speaking of Solomon as a type of Christ, "as long as the sun and moon endure throughout all generations." Another one, Psalm 89, verse 37, "It," speaking of the throne of David, "shall be established forever as the moon, as a faithful witness in the heaven." And then Jeremiah 31:36, "If those ordinances," that's the ordinances of the sun and moon, "depart from before me, saith the Lord, then the seed of Israel shall also cease from being a nation before me forever." So think about that. Think about these promises attached to the moon. Now, think about all the ancient nations you read about in the Bible. You know, where are the Amalekites? Where are the Ammonites? Where are the Moabites? Where are the Edomites? Where are the Hittites? And so forth. Of all those ancient nations, which one exists today? Israel. It's the only one. Okay? So how do I know that Israel exists? Because I can go outside and I can see the moon. As long as I can see the moon, Israel will always exist. Now, they dug up some Philistines some years back. They found their graves and dug them up, did DNA analysis. You know, there's nobody in here that's related to a Philistine. Nobody in the whole world. That whole line of DNA went out of existence. Now, you may eat like a Philistine, but that's a different matter, okay? So there's no Philistines around today. They're all gone, okay? But Israel endures as a nation, and we know that because of the moon. Now, Pastor can tell me if I'm right in my theology here, But it looks like in the new heavens and new earth, there's going to be a new moon. Isaiah 66, 22 and 23 says, "For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. And shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord." So it looks like there's going to be a new moon. So this is not the kind of new moons we have that are dark. This is a real new moon, new sun, new earth, new everything, okay, in that new heavens and new earth. It's also used as a sign of coming calamity. There's lots of verses about this in the Bible. I chose one. Luke 21:25, "There shall be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars upon the earth, distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring." That sea and waves roaring is usually speaking of political upheaval, the mass of humanity, all right? So what nation could you go to on earth where there is not perplexity? Okay? So a bank fails in California, and there's a lot of perplexity. Okay? People are wondering if their savings are safe in their banks and that type of thing. And you go to, you could pick a country at random, and there's upheaval and perplexity. And that's the world that we live in. And it's going to get increasingly so toward the end of the age. Also speaks of the glory of Christ and the millennial kingdom. So Isaiah 30, verse 26, "Moreover, the light of the moon shall be as the light of the sun. The light of the sun shall be sevenfold as the light of 7 days in the day that the Lord bindeth up the breach of his people and healeth the stroke of their wound." Now, I actually think this is poetic. I don't think it's literal because of those sevens. So it's saying that our existence in that millennial kingdom is going to be, infinitely better than what we experience today. So that 7 is a number of perfection. It's not literally the sun's going to be 7 times brighter, but it's talking about how God's people are going to exist and be treated in that future kingdom. So here's a picture of the moon and an aurora, northern lights. When we used to take mission teams to Nova Scotia. Before we went to Australia, we went to Nova Scotia. We went 9 summers to Nova Scotia with Bob Jones University students. And we were in Nova Scotia when there was this beautiful aurora. And my coworker, Nelson McGew, who's now with the Lord, my daughter was Katie, who's the pastor's wife in Australia, was 2 years old. And he picked her up. And look, he's trying to show her the beautiful lights in the sky. They were amazing. But she had been playing with a stick on the ground. And she said, stick. She wanted that stick, all right? And he, for the life of him, couldn't get her to look up. She just had her mind set on that stick. And I think that's the way we are, okay? See, here's all these wonderful promises that God has given to us for this incredible future that we have with him. And we never look up. Usually we're looking down. Look at these things, okay? We never look up. So next time you go out and the moon's out, look up at the moon and think about the wonderful future that God has prepared for all those who love him, that we're going to get to enjoy. And that should put things in perspective. I hope this is encouraging to you tonight to hear about the moon. And we just don't look up enough and think about the future with Christ. Okay, what questions do you have tonight? Anything about the moon or anything else? Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Is that a moon? A moose. It looks like a moose, doesn't it? They have lots of moose. We took mission teams to Newfoundland, and they have more moose than people up there. And there's a friend of mine who hit a moose, and it flipped up, and the hooves went on through the windshield on either side of his head like that. And I said, "What were you thinking when that happened?" He said, "I was thinking about how bad a moose smells." Because it was wrapped around his head. So yes, that's a moose. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Since we're talking about moon and everything in the book of the Revelation, we read these things, and the moon shall be turned into blood. How do you deal with that?
So the moon is turned in the blood whenever dust is thrown up from the earth, okay? And so some people interpret that as being the aftermath of a nuclear exchange or heavy bombardment or something like that, or maybe an asteroid crashing to the earth. We know Wormwood's going to come and crash to the earth. And so it's going to throw a lot of dust, and that dust turned both the sun and the moon into that blood color. You can see it sometimes. You see the moon low on the horizon, and if there's a storm coming from the west, and you see the moon in the west, you'll see it turn red because of the dust. The raindrops hit the dust and throw it up in the air, and so that because of diffraction, it causes the moon to turn red. Yep.
What actually causes the aurora?
So the aurora is caused by charged particles, okay, coming mostly from the sun. We call it the solar wind. And so the God has placed a barrier around the earth called the magnetic field that protects us from all that hard radiation. And so the pole, it goes in the North Pole and goes in the South Pole like this. So the charged particles ride the magnetic field to the North Pole where nobody lives, or to the South Pole where nobody lives, and keeps our DNA from being destroyed. Okay, it's a protection. Now, the problem is that they want to go into outer space. They want to send people to Mars. Well, people on the International Space Station, remember those two brothers? One's a congressman and one's a astronaut, Kelly brothers. They're twins, identical twins. So they sent one into space and one left on the Earth. Well, when the one came back from space after a year, his DNA was greatly altered. I mean, they were shocked to see how deteriorated his DNA was. Now, the body can fix some of that, but some of it can't fix. Well, people that go to Mars, they're not going to have even that protection. There's not going to be any protection there at all. And so I'm not sure we can keep people alive long enough to get them to Mars. So I think all that hard radiation that we're protected by the magnetic field, I think what it'll do will kill the gut bacteria first, and the astronauts will starve to death. They won't be able to digest their food, and they'll starve to death before they get to Mars. So see if I'm right about that. Again, Elon Musk doesn't agree with me, but he's not going. There's 1,500 teenagers that have volunteered for a one-way trip to Mars. Okay, so don't go, all right? If you think that's a good idea, don't go. So when you see the aurora, you should say, here's a shield that God has placed around us to protect us from all this hard radiation. Unique to the Earth. Well, no, there is a magnetic field around Jupiter, for example, but nobody lives on Jupiter. Okay, but there's no magnetic field on the moon. There's none on the Mars. Okay, so why some planets have it? Mercury has a magnetic field, and we don't know why that is or how it's lasted so long. They don't have a good theory for that. So there's a lot of interesting things there.
Is there anything else that can protect, like the astronauts going to the moon, that since they know that, is there anything they do to protect them from that?
Well, I mean, I guess you could make your space capsule make it of lead, but it'd be too hard to get it up in the air, all right? So one of the things they've thought about is they want to mine the water on the moon. There's a little bit of ice on the moon in some of the craters and so forth. They want to mine that and enclose the astronauts in a big capsule with water on the outside, and that water would give them some protection, not like lead. But that's a long way away. Think about how hard that would be to mine water on the moon and then build a spacecraft and send it to Mars. Yes?
Is it true that the ozone layer around Earth is damaged?
So the question is about the ozone layer. Is it damaged? So,
Well, I've heard
yes. So let me back up. So there was a problem. We developed these chemical compounds called fluorochlorocarbons, all right? And these compounds we developed because other refrigerants we had in the past were explosive, flammable. And so they'd spring a leak and the whole thing go, and everybody dies. And so scientists, chemists, developed these chlorofluorocarbons as a safe alternative, and they're very stable. But when they get out of your refrigerator, out of your car, air conditioner, or whatever, they slowly float. It takes about 10 years, but they float up to the stratosphere. And there, the hard radiation from the sun tears them apart and destroys the ozone layer. Okay? So again, it's one of those things where we cause the problem ourselves, because there's an old adage that says you can't change just one thing. You think you're changing this, but you end up changing other things that you didn't think about. That's what happened to us. And so now the refrigerants they use are not as stable, so that they'll actually break down here rather than up in the stratosphere. So the ozone layer is starting to heal as a result of the changes that we've made. So it's better than it was, say, 20 years ago. Okay? Yes, sir, your question. What about the Northern Lights? Okay, Northern Lights could be green or blue or red. So they're very pretty. And I can't tell you why they're all those different colors, because that takes a lot of chemistry to explain that. Okay, but that's why God made them. Yeah, what's your question? Can you go somewhere to see the Northern Lights? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, so we met people in Australia, and they would take trips to Finland, of the very north part of Finland, to see the Northern Lights. That was the whole purpose of them going, because they wanted to see, the closer you get to the North Pole, the more easily you can see the Northern Lights. Now, back in 1869, there's something called the Carrington event. Carrington event, there was a coronal mass discharge. That is, part of the sun got spit out. And it hit the Earth directly. And when that happened, they had aurora down in Havana, Cuba, Mexico City. Okay? We've never seen anything like that in our lifetime. Well, back in those days, it wasn't a problem, because all they had was telegraph. And so the telegraph wire started singing, and the telegraph keys kept going up and down on their own, and the telegraph paper caught on fire spontaneously. So that was a problem, but it wasn't a big problem. But we figure if something like the Carrington event happened today, now we have a problem. Now I was in a church in Norfolk and talked to a guy who makes he services those big transformers, and the ones they shoot up from time to time and people lose their electricity. And I asked him, this is right. If that coronal mass discharge hit the Earth directly like it did in 1869, it would fry the whole grid and destroy all those transformers. And they only have like 2 on hand at any given time, those big transformers. And so the estimate is it would take 2 full years to get the electric grid back up. Okay? So you kids that like your computer games, you're going to have a problem. So how would you like to live without electricity for 2 years? Is that possible? It certainly is possible. Okay? All right. Anything else? Yep.
I was going to ask, I think you were talking about it once already, but I noticed when I lived in Canada, the farther north that I got, and when it got into the Northwest Territories, the colors were bright and very colorful. Is that because of the intensity of the radiation?
That's right, because the intensity of the radiation, it's stronger up there. If you're at the North Pole, you get a pretty good dose of that stuff. It's not good for people who develop cancer. Even people who fly a lot, who fly real high in the sky, around the world, they develop cancer faster than people that just stay on the ground, because that hard radiation can destroy your cells and the DNA and so forth. Do you have a question back there?
Could you comment a little bit on radiocarbon dating and the different methods that the scientists
Okay.
use and problems that we as creationists would?
Can you wait till tomorrow? Okay? Because I have slides tomorrow. We're going to talk about tomorrow. So tomorrow we're going to talk about the age of the Earth, and that's one of the common questions we get is about radio dating. Otherwise, I have to do, this kind of thing. Yes. Which is? Will the sun explode? Okay. Well, sometimes stars explode, and they call it a supernova. But there's no evidence that our sun is going to go supernova. But other stars. So one you may have heard of. You ever heard of Betelgeuse? Okay. Yeah. So Betelgeuse is a red star, and it looks like it's ready to explode. And it's close enough to us that it would actually affect life on Earth if it does that. And so that's one of the things they're concerned about. There are a lot of things they're concerned about, but all these things are in God's hands. Okay, anything else? Those are all good questions. So if you have any more you want me to talk about tomorrow night, I hope you'll fill out a piece of paper. Yes?
So do you think human life will never exist on Mars then? Because obviously, like, people have, if Elon Musk has plans to make it happen.
Yes. Yes. So Mars is a terrible place. There's no magnetic field, so there's no protection. So if you're going to live there, you're going to have to live underground. The soil is made of poisons. It has lots of perchlorates in it. Now, perchlorates are what we use for oxidizers in jet fuel, okay? So it's poisonous soil, okay? And there's very little oxygen. There's very little water there, and it's very, very cold. I mean, like 350 degrees, minus 350 degrees, okay? So why they think anybody could survive on Mars for any length of time is beyond me. So I really don't think they'll make it. I don't think human beings will make it to Mars. And if they do, I'm still alive, let me know, okay, that I'm wrong. But I don't think they'll make it. The earth, the Bible says, the earth has he given to the children of men. Right? This is the planet he made for us, not out there. Now, if you're interested in what's going on out there, just build robots and send them out. It's a lot cheaper. Use some of that fancy electronic stuff from Collins Aerospace and go out there, okay? But it'd be a lot cheaper to do that than to send people out there. We don't belong out there, okay? And robots do just as good a job. They sent that Dragon capsule, they sent it all the way around the moon with no people on it. They didn't need people on it, okay? So I just think it's a waste of money, waste of my money, your money, taxpayer money. Anything else? That's all really good. Well, thank you so much, and I'll let the pastor close it out.